crown without an heir, a promise broken, a kingdom torn apart. For 18 brutal years, England became a battlefield where cousin fought cousin, where castles rose like mushrooms only to fall like leaves, and where the very concept of justice crumbled under the weight of ambition. Welcome back to Crimes of the Crown. This is your host, Chris, and this is the story of the Anarchy, when England's throne became a prize so coveted that it nearly destroyed the realm itself. But the real crime? It all began with one man's desperate promise and his nephew's ultimate betrayal. December 1st, 1135. King Henry I of England lay dying in Normandy, and with his final breath, he took England's stability with him. You see, 25 years earlier, Henry had suffered the greatest tragedy of his reign. His only legitimate son, William, had drowned in the White Ship disaster. And with no male heir, Henry made a decision that would plunge England into chaos. He named his daughter, Empress Matilda, as his successor. But there was one problem, you see. Medieval England had never been ruled by a queen regnant, and Henry's nephew, Stephen of Blois, had other plans. What followed was not just a civil war. It was the complete breakdown of law and order. Nobles built illegal castles, switched sides like the wind, and turned England into what chroniclers called a land where Christ and his saints slept. So how did a succession dispute spiral into nearly 2 decades of anarchy? And what crimes were committed in the name of the crown? When news of Henry I's death reached England, Stephen of Blois was already in motion, you see. While Matilda remained in Anjou with her husband, Stephen raced to Winchester. And here's where our first crime takes place. Stephen had sworn an oath, not once but multiple times, to support Matilda's claim to the throne. Every single major noble had, you see. It was called the Winchester Oath, and breaking it was considered not just treasonous, but sacrilegious, a crime against God himself. But Stephen was persuasive, and he had something Matilda didn't. He was actually there. Within 3 weeks of Henry's death, Stephen had convinced the Archbishop of Canterbury to crown him king. The justification? Stephen claimed that Henry had changed his mind on his deathbed, releasing the nobles from their oaths. Convenient considering the only witnesses were Stephen's supporters themselves. And for 3 years, it seemed Stephen had gotten away with this perfect crime. England accepted him as king. The nobles who had sworn to support Matilda now bent the knee to Stephen. But Matilda had not forgotten. Oh no, in 1139, she was ready to collect what she believed was rightfully hers. What made the anarchy truly anarchic wasn't just the war between Stephen and Matilda. It was what the nobles did while the crown was contested. With central authority weakened, barons across England committed what can only be described as state-sponsored criminality. They built castles without royal permission, over 1,000 of them. These weren't just fortifications, they were power bases for extortion, kidnapping, and territorial expansion. Take Geoffrey de Mandeville, Earl of Essex. This man turned betrayal into an art form. He switched sides between Stephen and Matilda no fewer than 4 times, each switch earning him more lands, more power, more castles. But Mandeville's greatest crime wasn't his betrayals. It was what he did from his Finland strongholds. He essentially became a medieval crime lord, ransoming travelers, extorting money from monasteries, and turning the Cambridgeshire Fens into his personal kingdom of terror. And he wasn't alone. Across England, nobles were committing what the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle called devilries. Torture, murder, and systematic extortion became commonplace. The chronicler described it this way. Every great man built his castles and held them against the king. They filled the land full of castles. They cruelly oppressed the wretched people by making them work at these castles, and when the castles were finished, they filled them with devils and evil men. But perhaps the most shocking crime of this period was committed not by a rogue baron, but by someone much closer to the throne. February 2nd, 1141, the Battle of Lincoln. This single day would witness the most dramatic reversal of fortune in medieval English history, and reveal the true depths of noble treachery. Stephen, confident in his position, had laid siege to Lincoln Castle. What he didn't know was that several of his most trusted earls had already been negotiating with Matilda in secret. At the height of the battle, as Stephen fought desperately against Matilda's forces, his own nobles committed the ultimate betrayal. The Earl of Chester, the Earl of Lincoln, even Stephen's own half-brother fled the field, leaving the king to fight alone. Stephen was captured. For the first time since the Norman conquest, an English king was taken prisoner by his own subjects. But here's where the story takes an even darker turn. Matilda, finally within reach of her crown, was about to make a series of decisions that would prove she could be just as ruthless as any of her enemies. She imprisoned Stephen in Bristol Castle in chains, treating an anointed king like a common criminal. She alienated the church by threatening to remove bishops who had supported Stephen, and most fatally, she refused to confirm the privileges of London citizens. The Londoners' response was swift and violent. They drove Matilda from the city just as she was about to be crowned, forcing her to flee for her life. The woman who should have been England's first queen regnant had snatched defeat from the jaws of victory through her own political crimes. Even the chroniclers of the time struggled to make sense of what they were witnessing. How had England, once the most efficiently governed kingdom in Europe, descended into such chaos? The evidence they recorded paints a picture of systemic criminality at every level of society. The Peterborough Chronicle reported that men said openly that Christ and his saints slept. Churches were robbed, monasteries burned, and the very concept of sanctuary violated. But perhaps the most damning evidence comes from the archaeological record. Excavations at castle sites from this period reveal mass graves, evidence of systematic torture, and coins deliberately broken, a sign that normal commerce had completely broken down. The economic impact was devastating. England's population may have dropped by as much as 10% during the Anarchy. Entire villages were abandoned. The royal treasury, once the envy of Europe, was completely depleted. Yet amidst all this chaos, one crime stands out as particularly shocking. Not for its violence, but for its calculated cruelty. You see, in 1142, Stephen besieged Matilda in Oxford Castle. As winter set in, Matilda faced starvation or capture. Her escape became the stuff of legend. She rappelled down the castle walls in the dead of night, dressed in white to blend in with the snow, and walked across the frozen Thames to freedom. But Stephen's crime wasn't in besieging her. It was in what he threatened to do to her supporters. He publicly declared that any noble caught aiding Matilda would be hanged as a traitor, turning political opposition into capital offense. This wasn't medieval justice. This was state terrorism. The end of the anarchy came not through victory, but through exhaustion. By 1153, both Stephen and Matilda had lost their appetite for war. But it was Matilda's son, the future Henry II, who would provide the solution. The Treaty of Wallingford was a masterpiece of medieval diplomacy, you see. Stephen would remain king for life, but Henry would be his heir. The illegal castles would be destroyed, and the rogue barons would be brought to heel. Stephen died in 1154, and Henry II ascended to the throne, beginning the Plantagenet dynasty. His first act? Systematically dismantling the criminal networks that had flourished during the anarchy. Over 1,000 illegal castles were destroyed. Rogue barons were either brought into line or eliminated, and the rule of law was restored. But the scars ran deep. The anarchy had proven that even the strongest kingdom could collapse if its nobles lost faith in their king. It was a lesson that would echo through English history for centuries to come. So what can we learn from the anarchy? This wasn't just a civil war. It was a complete breakdown of the social contract between ruler and ruled. The real criminals weren't just Stephen and Matilda, locked in their struggle for the crown. The true crime was committed by an entire noble class that chose personal gain over national stability, something many of us can still relate to till this day. Geoffrey de Mandeville, the earl who switched sides 4 times, died as he lived, violently, struck down by an arrow while besieging an abbey he intended to rob. Stephen, the usurper king, died peacefully in his bed. His promise to make Henry his heir, perhaps his only genuine act of statesmanship. And Matilda? She returned to Normandy, never to set foot in England again. But her son would become one of England's greatest kings, ruling an empire that stretched from Scotland to the Pyrenees. The anarchy ended, but its lessons remain. Power without legitimacy is temporary. Loyalty without trust is meaningless. And sometimes the greatest crimes are committed not in dark alleys, but in the corridors of power. What do you think? Was Stephen's usurpation justified by his success, or was the price England paid too high? And could the anarchy happen again in a modern democracy? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this dive into England's darkest political crisis as fascinating as I did, be sure to hit that like button, subscribe to Crimes of the Crown, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss our next investigation into the shadowy world of royal intrigue. Until next time, remember, behind every crown lies a crime.